a video biography for Touching Up Our Roots, Georgia's LGBT History Project Initiative, and for the Center for Civil and Human Rights. And I'm here with Winston Johnson, who is a famous person.
Not exactly.
Infamous. Infamous.
That's more
person.
like it.
So what I want to do first is just kind of have you tell us who you are. And if you could start with your birth date.
July 4th, 1941.
1941? Oh my God. And where were you born?
I was born in Valdosta, Georgia.
And you grew up there?
No, I don't remember living there, actually. We moved away when I was 3 or 4 years old, and I grew up in North Florida, just across the line, between Valdosta and Tallahassee.
And you had an older brother?
I have a brother who's 7 years older, and then I had 6 half-siblings that were my father's children by his first wife who died. And the oldest one of those is 26 years older than me, and she's still living. She's 92.
So then you grew up in North Florida?
Greenville, Florida, which is nowhere.
And anything you want to say about your childhood that was outstanding?
Nothing was outstanding about my childhood because I was quite different. I had my little doll family, and I just wasn't like other boys very much. And I didn't really like Greenville the older I got, and so by the time I got out of school and I went to college, I knew I never wanted to go back to a place like that. A small town, could never do it again.
When you were a little boy, did you think of yourself as being gay? Or?
I just thought of myself as being different. I didn't know. I didn't know what gay meant until I was probably 25 years old. But I just felt different. I wasn't like the other boys around me or my brothers.
Because you played with dolls. And,
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't just a big old girl, but I did have my little doll family, and I can remember when my family was trying to get me away from the dolls.
Did you realize when you were a boy or a teenager that you were attracted to other boys?
Yeah, I did. And some of the boys I was attracted to were temporarily attracted to me too, but they sort of grew out of it, you know. They were basically straight, but I think teenage boys will kind of do anything when they discover their sexuality, and so I thought that I would grow out of it too, but I didn't.
So then where did you go to college?
University of Florida, Gainesville, Florida.
And you said that I think when you were a sophomore that you kind of had a crisis.
I really did. I did well my first 2 years in college, much better than I should have done considering the preparation I had in high school. But one reason I did so well was because all I did was study and go to class and study and go to class. And I was repressing my sexuality because all along I kept thinking it's going to change. You know, I'm going to be attracted to girls any day now. And I didn't. And the summer of 1961, I turned 20. And that was the summer before my junior year. And it was an awful summer. I mean, I knew I had not changed, and I figured that at 20, you were mature. So I didn't think I was going to change, and I had not been prepared to live my life as a homosexual because all I'd ever heard about homosexuals was horrible stuff, you know, child molesters and going directly to hell and all that kind of thing. So I became suicidal. When I went back to university, I started smoking and doing all kind of stuff that I hadn't done before, and then I quit going to classes, and I would tell my parents. I would go home weekends. It was only a couple of hours to where I lived, and I would tell them I was going to flunk out, and I really wanted to drop out of school, and they would just, act like I was just an alarmist, and I knew I was going to flunk out, and I did. I made one D. I'd never made a D before in my life, and that was the only passing grade I had. The rest were Fs, so I was suspended. And I wanted to go in the Peace Corps, and my father was very much opposed to that. That was not an option, so.
Did you confide in anyone about, because you said that this was all due to your realizing that you were gay?
Yeah, no, I didn't. And I actually sought out a counselor at the university, Dr. Fouts, and I liked her. And I told her everything about how my parents were, not very understanding and not very well educated and all of those things. But the one thing I could not bring myself to tell her was that I was pretty sure I was gay. And so I never spoke of that to her. But I did become suicidal, and I went out on Archer Road in Gainesville, which was just a 2-lane, isolated road at the time, and drove my car over 100 miles an hour with the intention of just slamming it into the trees. But I chickened out at the last minute.
You just couldn't do that?
I just couldn't do it. But I was disgusted with myself because I couldn't do it. I didn't know the word gay. Right. And all I knew was queer, which was a horrible word. And I'd heard that, I'd been called a sissy when I was young, and I'd been called queer when I was in high school a few times. It was a more gentle time then, so people weren't as hostile as you see now. I mean, I think there was less, as long as you stayed in the closet, I think people were not as unkind as they are now to kids in high school. But anyone who was, I guess, more queer than I was a real target, I can remember other people who were more obviously homosexual than I was, and they did have a lot of harassment. Still not in the ugly way that it's done today, real ugly way, but.
I was thinking that everything in the movies and TV and books, that it was all negative, pretty much most of it was negative about.
If you ever saw anything in a book or in a movie about a homosexual, they usually ended up dead, either by suicide or by some other tragic way. You just got the message that if you were homosexual, you weren't of any value at all. And I didn't think I was.
You should just go ahead and kill yourself.
Right, yeah. That's the feeling I had.
And were you aware of any gay life or any, I know there weren't any student organizations, were there any gay places to go?
There were no gay places to go, there were no gay newspapers, there were no gay organizations. And in Florida at the time, the president of the Florida Senate, Charlie Johns, was what we would now call a notorious homophobe. And he had started these investigations into homosexuality in schools and colleges, and they actually printed a report that was almost like pornography, some of the pictures. In later years, I found out the gay guys bought that because it was like porn. But when that was published with names, a lot of people committed suicide, and that was around 1960. And I remember hearing people talk about that some college professors had committed suicide because their names were put in that publication. It was a really ugly time in Florida for people who were gay. And you certainly didn't want to be one.
So did you flunk out of school?
I flunked out of school, and then I worked. We had a hardware store at home in Greenville, and I worked in the store. And then I went back to university in the fall of 62, because that's the earliest that I could go back. And I didn't want to go back then, but my parents insisted that if I was going to go to college, I was going to go then. And that was a big mistake, and I knew it was. And I took a minimum load of 12 hours. I had taken 18 hours 2 years earlier and almost had a B average. But I took a minimum load, and after a few weeks, I could see that I couldn't handle 12 hours then. So I had to petition to drop to 9 hours and still be a full-time student. And they let me drop to 9 hours. And then Thanksgiving, I decided I was through. And I just packed my bags and went home and didn't go back. I actually went home and worked in the hardware store for a little while. Then I went to Jacksonville, and I got a job working for the railroad. It's now the CSX. They were headquartered there. But I then got permanently suspended because, I was on probation when I went back.
So you never did graduate?
Never did graduate. I did end up completing my junior year at Jacksonville University, going at night and working.
So what got you through that time? I mean, you didn't drive your car into the trees, and you didn't. But it sounds like you didn't have any support, and no one else knew you were gay.
No, and I didn't know anyone else was gay. I found out later that there were a lot of guys that were in the fraternity that I pledged that were gay, but I didn't know it at the time. And but when I went to Jacksonville, I had a hometown friend who did not go to college. He'd gone there out of high school and had a job. And he was one of the boys that I knew from my high school days. And he was gay, but he didn't know anything about a gay community in Jacksonville in 1962. And but we got an apartment together. He'd been living with his cousin, but we got an apartment together, and we started sort of driving around the streets of Jacksonville at night, cruising around the streets of Jacksonville, and we discovered sort of an all-night coffee shop where gay people hung out. I mean, we still didn't know the term gay, but we gathered that some of the people in there were just like us. So that's how I started finding out that Joe and I weren't the only two in the world.
And did you develop a circle of friends then?
Gradually, yeah. In fact, we heard someone in that restaurant talking about one of the bars, and I was turning 21 that summer. We both were. My birthday was the 4th of July, and his was the 31st. And so as soon as I turned 21, we went to Don Wheeler's Bar of Music. And they had a piano bar, and they had this lady that played the piano, and all the gay boys sat around the piano and sang show tunes. And so we went in there, and we thought we were just real mature, but I'm sure everybody looked at us and just knew we were as green as we could be. And so they carded us, and we were out of there in about 10 minutes. And so we waited until after the 31st, after Joe's birthday, and then we went back there. And then we started to meet people who were gay. And then we found out there were other gay bars at the beach. The beach was where most of the gay bars were in those days. There was one other bar downtown that was sort of a mixed bar. It was called Howard's, and a lot of traveling men that stayed in the downtown hotels went in that bar. to meet guys, but that was not a bar we ever went to much. Most of the bars were at the beach where, there was some dancing. There was not much because you weren't supposed to dance, but there was a little bit.
Well, it sounds like life got a lot better.
It did get a lot better.
And you finally had a community.
Yeah. Right.
And then in 1964...
I met Leon, the love of my life, in
Tell
1964.
us about meeting Leon.
Well, I was fixed up with Leon by a guy that I worked with at the railroad who was gay. He kept, the expression back then was dropping hairpins. I don't know if people know that now, but when you're dropping hints about whether someone's gay, that was called dropping hairpins. And one day we were having lunch, and David just dropped a whole handbag full of hairpins. And finally, I told him that I was gay, and he told me that he was. And we were not attracted to each other. I mean, we had become real good friends then at work. But sometime after that, I had seen Leon a couple of times in his brand new 64 Riviera by this time. And I had a new Chevrolet convertible, and we'd spotted each other on the bridge going to work a couple of times. And David knew him, and I didn't think he was gay. I just didn't think he could possibly be gay because he didn't seem like he was gay, but I thought he was real attractive. And so I mentioned to David about him. He said, "Oh, I know him." And he said, "You want to meet him?" And I said, "Yeah, but I don't think he's gay." And he said, "Oh, yeah, he is." I know he is. So anyway, he had a cookout on April the 26th, 1964, with lots of lesbians and dogs and gay boys. And the whole purpose of it was for Leon and I to meet. And so after the cookout, everybody went to the beach, to the bars, except for Leon and I. And we spent that night at David's. And we stayed together for the rest of his life, 42 years.
That's so wonderful. I mean, these are stories that we just have to know, have to tell. So then you and Leon became a couple.
Yeah, we didn't realize that we were going to, we didn't have any expectation of staying together. We didn't even think it was possible. We didn't know of any men who had long-term relationships. We'd never heard of that. And so we just, before we knew it, we had fallen in love with each other. And after a couple of years, we really thought that we would have to split at some point so everybody wouldn't figure out that we were queer, because we just knew that we couldn't stay together. It just didn't seem feasible. Back in those days, you couldn't hold down a job if you were known to be gay. People got fired because they were gay. And Leon had already been in the Army. He had served 3 years in the Army. But I was 6 years younger than him, and so this was during Vietnam, and the draft was just nipping at my heels. And so I had to do something to keep from getting drafted. And so I applied for the Naval Air Reserve. And of course, one of the questions was, do you have homosexual tendencies? And if you check that, the common knowledge was that it was a huge mistake to check it, because everybody would know, it would follow you the rest of your life, and you wouldn't be able to get a job and all that. So, of course, I checked that I didn't have homosexual tendencies, and so I was accepted into the Naval Air Reserve, and I went. That was in the fall of 1963, and I met Leon right after I came back from my 6 months active duty in April of '64. And so I stayed in the reserves for 6.5 years, and was honorably discharged. He was honorably discharged from the Army. But anyway, that was, I mean, if I knew then what I know now, I probably would have checked that I was homosexual. But I was so afraid of what it would do to my future that I lied about it.
When did you and Leon start living together?
We were together for, let's see, almost 2 years, I think, before we actually moved in together. I had an apartment, and he lived at home with his parents. And but after about 2 years, less than 2 years, I wanted to live with him. And he did too. And I mean, he really had it made living at home. That's one reason he could afford a new Riviera, which was a pretty expensive car in those days, because he had no expenses at all for food or, home or anything. But we got an apartment together in, I guess it was late 1965. And that was just a big thrill. We moved into this new 1964 apartment complex that had a pool in the middle, and it was nice.
And you did know some other couples, some other male couples that lived together, right?
Yeah, in fact, we moved in an apartment that two guys moved out of, and they had been together about 10 years. And one of those guys was from the next town to mine. I had known his mother and had known his sister, and so that was kind of a revelation because I knew of him, and to find out that there was another person from my county who was gay. But they were the first people I'd known of who'd been in a long-term relationship, and his partner was a doctor, and I thought that was pretty amazing. His partner had been married and had 5 children, but was then divorced. So, but we started to meet other gay men and lesbians, and we found out that some people were in relationships, but still, we certainly didn't think it was a lifetime thing.
One of the things I was thinking as you're talking is people don't have a sense anymore of how secret it all used to be, and how we pretty much were on our own, and we had to go out and we had to find people, and we had to find places, and we had to really develop our own networks. There were not organizations, there weren't groups to go to. You pretty much kind of had to find people yourself.
Yeah, you really did, because in 1967, I was going to be transferred. My job was going to be moved to Richmond, Virginia. And Leon had just lost his job, and we wanted to stay together. I did not want to go to Richmond, but I couldn't stay with the company I was with unless I went to Richmond. And Leon was looking for a job, and we decided that we would try to move to Atlanta because his family lived in Jacksonville. We sort of wanted to get away from his family and mine. Mine lived 120 miles away. And so we both started looking for jobs in Atlanta. We'd come up and, get interviews and that kind of thing. He got a job right away up here. And he moved up a couple of months before I did because I got a job later. But that's the best thing we ever did, was come to Atlanta. And Atlanta was New York City compared to Jacksonville anyway, so that was a good thing. And there were several gay bars here, and we had made some friends here who had friends in Jacksonville, so that helped because we sort of already had a built-in social life by knowing these people before we moved here. And then we started meeting a lot of people when we came here.
Let me backtrack for just a second. Did you think your family is his family, your family, that they knew that you had a relationship?
I don't think they did then, because we did everything we could do to make sure that they didn't know. We would say things like, oh, well, I mean, his family had been to our apartment and my family had been there, but they just thought we were roommates. I mean, we were both, I was in my 20s, Leon had turned 30 by that time, but we just pretended to be roommates. They never, ever saw any affection between us or anything. And then when Leon moved here, it was a real good excuse for me to say that, you know, I didn't want to move to Richmond, Virginia, and I'd rather live in Atlanta. Well, my family thought that was great because Atlanta was a lot closer to home than Richmond was. So that was my reason for coming to Atlanta, and since Leon was my friend, I could share his apartment, you know. We just went to such ridiculous lengths to conceal who we were, you know.
I think it's important for people to know that.
We had separate bedrooms.
Oh, you did.
We always made sure that everybody knew that was Leon's bedroom and this is my bedroom. And if family came to visit, we would share one of the bedrooms so that they could have, you know, you can have my bedroom and Leon won't mind if I sleep with him.
Mighty straight of you.
Right.
Now, when you came to Atlanta, was this an idea also that you had in mind that it was a gay mecca?
Well, we had been here a few times to visit friends, and it did seem like a gay mecca to us. Of course, it was nothing like what it has become, you know, in the ensuing 40 years, but compared to Jacksonville, it was a gay mecca. Lots of places to go. There were even restaurants that were very gay friendly, you know. There was not anything like that in Jacksonville. But, you know, still then there were no gay organizations or newspapers or anything like that. Most of the socialization was private dinners at people's homes. There wasn't nearly as much going out to eat, you know, as there is now. People would have dinner parties, people would have cocktail parties. In fact, when we first came here, everybody used to joke about how formal Atlanta was compared to Florida, because almost every invitation you got back then said coat and tie. Coat and tie, can you imagine? So all these gay boys would get together and go to somebody's apartment and have cocktails and wear a coat and tie.
So you wear a coat and tie to a private cocktail party?
Yeah. I guess because people didn't want to see, you know, a lot of flamboyant gay men coming in and out of their apartment building, you know, so they thought it would look more acceptable.
So people
if we were dressed
still
up.
concerned about not being openly gay.
Right, very concerned about appearance. You know, you didn't want to offend anyone by letting them know that you might be gay, because our feeling was that if people knew we were gay, they would be offended.
How were you affected by Stonewall? The Stonewall.
Well, we were thrilled to hear about it. You know, that's all. We just heard about it, you know. But we heard a lot more about it in later years because there was no gay press back then. But, you know, the word did get out that had happened, but we didn't have nearly as many details then as we do now. But it was exciting to know that someone had said enough is enough. We weren't ready to say that down here, but and going to New York was just, you know, the most fabulous thing in the world, because you could go to Greenwich Village and see people actually holding hands and things like that, which you could not see in Atlanta. It was just unheard of. But even when we went to New York, we would make up lies. We stayed one night in the St. Regis Hotel because I got a discount there. And other times when we'd go to New York, we'd stay in some sleazy cheap place or the Y or something like that, when we always said we stayed at the St. Regis. And we would never tell anyone in our families that we went to Greenwich Village because most people had heard really bad things about Greenwich Village, that there were lots of queers there. So we would just not, we'd spend most of our time there, but we'd pretend like we'd spend all of our time, at Central Park and Radio City Music Hall and stuff like that, rather than telling the truth.
I remember that in the early 70s, there was the Gay Liberation Front in Atlanta,
Mm-hmm.
and there started to be some political activity, and I don't think there was a newspaper until maybe the mid-70s, but were you aware of that?
We were aware, we were afraid to get involved. I remember probably, I think 71 or 72, we went over to the park, but we sort of kept our distance. We were close enough that we could hear the speakers, but we were trying to act like we were just passing by so that if anyone we knew saw us, that they wouldn't think we were part of that. And it was really crappy to do that, but we were afraid. We were afraid we'd lose our jobs. And by that time, I had almost lost my job because I was gay.
Oh.
So I had every reason to be fearful.
So what happened?
Well, I had started to work for Eastern Airlines January 16th, 1968, in a job that was the lowest rung, but it was a great job. I was based at our sales office, which was up here in Midtown, and they had a brand new Lincoln Continental with a telephone in it, and I drove it. And it was not a limousine, it was just a regular sedan. And I thought I'd died and gone to heaven when I got that job because I'd never been in a car that had a telephone in it, and a few people had in those days. And I would pick up VIPs and Eastern executives and that kind of thing. And I wore a suit, I didn't wear a uniform, and if they wanted me at the airport 5 o'clock in the morning, I was there. Whatever they wanted, I did it. And I did it real well, and I started getting complimentary letters, which I still have. And I'd been there about a year. It was 1969, and my boss called me in, and I thought probably to give me a raise or something because I'd gotten so many nice letters from customers I'd met, and some of them were celebrities, and some of them were, CEOs of big corporations in Atlanta and other places. Well, he shut the door and sat down, and he said, Winston, I've been told that you're a homosexual. And, it almost knocked me over because I knew that meant, firing, because by this time I knew some other gay people. There was a sales rep in the office who had driven the car before I had, and he was gay, and we had become friends. And there was a guy who worked in reservations that I knew, and he'd been fired a couple of months before that because he was gay. And he was more obviously gay than I was, and they fired him, and that's why they fired him. So I thought, well, it's going to happen to me today. So I still can't believe I didn't get fired, but I didn't, because that's.
Did you deny it?
I denied it, and I'm glad I did, because had I said I was, I would have been fired, and who knows what would have happened. I might have had a real rough life, who knows. But I'm glad I denied it because I kept my job, and I had a great career there. But I said, Chuck, who told you that? And he said, well, I can't tell you who told me, but it came from one of our big corporate accounts. And I was 28 years old then, 27, 28, I think. And he was probably late 40s or 50 maybe. And I still can't believe I got by with this, but I said, well, is that all you're going to tell me? And he said, that's all I can tell you. I can't tell you who told me. And I said, well, if you can't tell me who said it, then I don't want to hear any more about it until you're willing to tell me the whole truth. And I got up and walked out. And I walked back to my desk, and I was just sure he was right behind me and was going to say, just pack up your desk and leave. And he didn't. So I couldn't believe it. He left the company a few years later, and I was really relieved when he left. And I had changed jobs. I'd moved to the airport. But when I heard he was dead a few years after that, that's when I really was relieved. But that next day, I think I had lunch with Jim, the gay guy who was a sales rep. And Jim had told me he wanted to have lunch. And he said, have you talked to Chuck? And I said, yes, he called me in yesterday and someone told him I was a homosexual. He said, well, I know where it happened and I was there. So he told me all about it, and it was at National Service Industries. It was a woman who was a secretary at National Service. And Leon worked in National Service. He was assistant controller in the accounting department. And Leon and I never, ever talked to each other at work. I mean, almost never. And if we did, we never said, I love you or anything affectionate. It was strictly business. And we cannot figure out how this woman, whose name was Ann, put two and two together, but somehow she did. And what happened, it was the airlines used to really cultivate the executive secretaries because they were the ones who booked travel. And they had a thing called Women in Travel, and they had a reception and food and all that, and they were standing over the food table, and Chuck, my boss, was telling her, you know, if any of your executives or board members, you know, if you really want to impress them, we've got a nice young man driving our executive car now. And his name is Winston Johnson, and just, you know, give us a call and we'll set it up. And she said, Winston Johnson. She said, I think he's married to this guy who works for us. And so that's where it came from. And we still have no idea how she knew that, because we had never done anything that would have given her that impression. But maybe she knew that we lived together somehow. Anyway, that's how close I came to getting fired for being gay.
So he just left you alone?
He left me alone after that. He never said anything. But I left there soon after that. A job opened at the airport, and I took it. And so I never, you know, I didn't work for him anymore. But then there was a sales rep job that opened after I was at the airport, and I did apply for that, and I didn't get it. And I'm sure that's why I didn't get it. And that was always, a sales rep job was a path to, you know, middle and higher management. So I feel sure Chuck was still there when that job came open. And I just know that's why I didn't get that job. But the job I ended up in at the airport ended up being a great job. And I stayed there for years. I was a customer service rep. I handled VIPs and executives. That was the days before everybody had access to private jets. And so it was a low-level management job. And I used to see the president of the University of Florida all the time, because Gainesville, Florida had air service to Atlanta. And if you were going north, you came to Atlanta on Eastern and connected here. So we always knew the people from Tallahassee and Gainesville and Pensacola, places like that. And the president of the university knew my brother, who was a well-known, successful alumnus of Florida. And he was always saying, well, what are your plans? You know, what are your plans for the future? And it was almost embarrassing. I told Dr. Marston one time, I said, well, I know you know my brother's a big achiever. And I said, I'm just really not. I'm satisfied where I am. And that was because I'd accepted that I had gone as far as I could go, being gay and being in a relationship with someone. And by this time, this was in the, you know, late 70s, 80s by the time I was telling Dr. Marston this. I knew that I had had other opportunities I could apply for middle-level management, but I knew that Leon and I were not going to split up. And if I moved him, if we both moved, it was just too much of a problem. Our relationship meant more to me than advancing at Eastern. So I just pretended that I was happy as a lark in that job, and in a way I was. But you accept limitations, or, I don't think it's as much so now, but I mean, there are a lot of places where you can still get fired for being gay, and until we get into past, there'll always be places that can do that. But I know that my generation, particularly, people self-limited what they would go for. People who didn't have that, straight people just didn't have that restriction on themselves. They could go for whatever they wanted to go for. If they were married or in a relationship, everybody expected that, And what used to irritate the hell out of me was people saying, well, why do you have to talk about it? And, straight people say, well, I'd like for you to meet my wife. Well, we couldn't do that, And we're talking about it, or, flaunting it in their faces if we said, this is my life partner. We got to the point in life where we said that every time, whoever it was that we met or were introduced to. But we went for many years where you never mentioned that you had a life partner.
Let me take you to Mrs. King. So you had been starting to work for Eastern in 1969?
I started in 68.
Mm-hmm. And then, 68. And so let's go to April 6, 1968. Tell us about
I was still driving that executive car and with the phone. And by this time, they'd actually moved the car to the airport. I worked for the manager at the airport by this time. And Mrs. Eugene McCarthy was making a long connection. There weren't nearly as many flights in those days. So she had about a 5-hour layover to go to some obscure town somewhere. And her husband, Eugene McCarthy, was campaigning for the presidency. And she was on the campaign trail, and she had this long layover, and she was in our first class lounge. And Bobby Kennedy had chartered an American Airlines plane to fly Dr. King's body back from Memphis. And I found out that the plane was landing in about a half an hour, and Eastern American didn't fly into Atlanta at that time, so Eastern was doing the ground handling for the airplane, fueling and unloading it and all of that. So that's why I knew about it. And so I told Mrs. McCarthy that Mrs. King was coming in with her husband's body, and the plane would be coming in a half hour. And she said she would love to see Mrs. King, that they were friends. And I said, well, I can take you over there. I have a car right at the back door of this lounge, and I'll take you over there. And I did. And they greeted each other when when Miss King came down the stairs. And then Mrs. King invited her to come over to the house. And so Ms. McCarthy turned to me and she said, can we do that? And I said, of course. And so Ms. McCarthy introduced me to Mrs. King, and we drove on over to the house, and we actually arrived there before Ms. King did. And that's how we became friends, and we started to see each other very frequently because Mrs. King started to travel a lot. She sort of picked up the mantle from Dr. King, and she started being a civil rights leader in her own right. And
let's go back to that day a little bit, because when she came out of the airplane down the stairs, what was she like? Did she collapse?
She was very, very composed. I mean, you could just see the grief in her face, but she was composed. She was very gracious. When she saw Mrs. McCarthy, she was very gracious, shook my hand when we were introduced. And I was amazed. I mean, even then, I thought about Jacqueline Kennedy. I really, thought she's going to handle this the same way Jackie Kennedy did, and she did. And
you think she was prepared for that to happen?
I think she was. I think he was too. I mean, you can hear his speeches, and especially the day before, and or just before he was killed. And I think they both knew that it was very likely that he would be killed early.
Did she ever talk to you about that?
No, not directly. She talked to me about other things. She talked about how Dr. King would have been 100% with the LGBT movement, and that they had actually talked about it, that this was another battle, down the road. And of course, one of his top people was Bayard Rustin, who was gay, and it was known that he was gay, and Dr. King was harassed. Of course, Bayard Rustin was harassed a lot, but Dr. King was given a lot of grief because he had a homosexual on his staff, and Rustin is the one who really staged the March on Washington in '63, and in spite of all of the negatives of keeping him around, Dr. King knew that he was talented, and that shouldn't have anything to do with it. And that's one of the reasons he and Mrs. King had talked about it. She said that they had talked about Rustin, whom they both loved, and that homosexuals in general were discriminated against at every turn, and they weren't ready then in the 60s, early 60s, middle 60s, to get into that because they had their eyes on the prize. But that movement is where our movement got its legs from. Leon and I were involved in that movement before we even thought about getting close to the gay liberation movement, because we were afraid if we got close to that we'd lose jobs, and we knew we could be more effective with income than without.
So you involved with the NAACP?
Yes, I worked on the Freedom Fund dinner with John Dale Johnson, who was the executive director here for many years, and Julian Bond had been the president. And I worked with Billy Aaron, Hank Aaron's wife, for United Negro College Fund. I worked on Urban League dinner a couple of years. It was safe to be white and be gay and be in those movements. That, early on, it didn't feel safe to get into gay rights issues.
So this was like the late '60s and then all through the '70s, mm-hmm. And you were part of all the African American NAACP.
Right. I was even introduced to someone one day by a young black woman, and she introduced me to a friend of hers as an honorary black, because she and I had worked on so many things in that community together. And we thought things were going pretty well for our community. We were sort of getting the crumbs that were falling off the civil rights movement, and we thought that was good.
And all during this time, you got more and more friendly with Mrs. King, and you were saying that yes. she traveled a lot, and so she would see you at the airport.
I would see her at the airport. Her assistant for many years, those first years, was Bernita Bennett, and Bernita's ex-husband was Dr. Fred Bennett, who worked with Dr. King for many years before his death. And they started traveling, and they didn't have a lot of money, and so of course they had coach tickets, and I had changed jobs shortly after the day that his body came back, and so I was in a job where I could upgrade her to first class.
The upgrade queen?
The upgrade queen, right. And in those days, there weren't frequent flyer programs, so frequent flyers didn't get first class unless they bought it. But we did frequently upgrade people who flew a lot. Our best customers, we would upgrade. So in a way, it was sort of the same thing that happens now. It just wasn't an official program where you earned miles and exchanged them for upgrades. We just tried to keep up with people who were our most frequent flyers, and we would upgrade them. And of course, she was one of our most frequent flyers. Dr. King had always flown Eastern because Eastern was always much nicer to them than Delta was. And Delta, I think now is great as regards civil rights and gay and lesbian rights and all of it. But in those days, Eastern was much more progressive than Delta was because Eastern was a New York-based company and Delta was a Southern-based company that had all the prejudice that went with that, you know. So she was 100% Eastern Airlines, and she always, whenever she had a chance at a big function, a dinner or whatever, she would always praise Eastern for our help and that kind of thing.
But also, if she flew Eastern, she had a really good chance of flying first class.
She absolutely did, and she knew it. She absolutely did.
So do you think that had something to do with your becoming friends? I mean, not the whole thing, obviously, but I mean, in other words, you just saw each other often.
We saw each other often, and then she started, I can't remember when exactly, but after her grieving period, she went off for a while up to New England and started writing her first book, My Life with Martin Luther King Jr. And I would see her, you know, she'd come home occasionally for a week or two and then she'd go back. And then after she wrote that book, she had the idea for the King Center. And she started the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change in her basement over on Sunset. And it was there for years before, you know, the buildings were built on Auburn Avenue. And she started making speeches and raising money for the center. And she had cataloged, well, maybe not cataloged, but collected everything he'd ever done, including his car, his last car, which the last I heard was still in the garage in that house on Sunset. But she knew everything that he had written and any awards he'd received, anything. She knew all that was very, very important. And so I started working on, when they started having fundraisers for the King Center, I would work on those because I felt committed to it, and I really just loved her. I mean, from the very beginning, we took to each other, and we cared about each other. For years, I would go by there every April 4th and take her one red rose. If she was home, I would drive over there and give her a red rose. And
so you just had a really good rapport.
We had a great rapport, and then I started involving Leon. I'd get him on these committees, like when they started having the Salute to Greatness dinner, I'd bring him with me, and he wasn't my partner, you know, he was just my friend Leon Allen, who was interested in working to, you know, create the King Center. And that was for years, it was just like that. I mean, we were always there together, but it wasn't, nobody admitted, I didn't admit, or did anyone else, that we were a couple.
Do you think like just being together just kind of spoke for itself?
I think it did. I mean, I think a lot of people, I mean, I know after a few years of that, most of the people that we got friendly with knew that we were a couple without saying it. And that went on like that until '86.
So before we get to that, did Mrs. King talk to you about her vision for the King Center?
Yeah, well, she would talk to, you know, always when we would be forming a committee for the next year's event, which eventually became King Week. There were all kinds of events every year. She would always talk to us, and she'd talk to me personally because I got to spend a good deal of time with her one-on-one because of the fact that she traveled so much, and we'd you know, spend some time together in the Eastern VIP room, which was completely private, or in the Ionosphere Club later on.
It sounds like you took really good care of her.
Well, I did, yeah. And it was because I was 100% behind what she was doing. I had a lot of colleagues that I worked with who hated to see me come to the gate with her, and they'd make nasty comments and, you know, why do you upgrade her every time she flies and that kind of thing. But I had the support of higher management, so, you know, I did what I wanted to do. But there were a lot of the agents who were working flights that still had that racism that just irritated the hell out of them, that every time Coretta King flew on a coach ticket, she rode in first class. But I just took a certain enjoyment out of that because I said, she's one of the best customers we have. And we do that for executives that have tons of money in fly coach. And we put them in first class. So
you kind of on a frequent flyer. You said, well, she's such a frequent flyer.
Yeah.
We should.
And
but also, I mean, the fact that she was an icon in her own right.
She was an icon. She was a celebrity, and she had been through hell to me, you know, having her husband assassinated, and it was human kindness to do that for her. And she gave Eastern her loyalty by always, and if people were flying in for events, speaking or whatever, she always had them fly on Eastern. Years later, Eastern became, you know, sponsors of some of the events, and we would give them tickets, you know, and we'd get credit for it in the programs and things like that. But she always said that, you know, Eastern was her airline, and she would always mention my name. I was her best friend at Eastern by far. I mean, I had two colleagues that did the same thing that I did, but they didn't have a personal relationship with her like I did. But when my colleague Shirley Buchanan, who was 20 years older than me when she when she retired, Mrs. King came to her retirement luncheon and talked about all of us, you know, and how much we'd meant. But I knew I was the one who meant more to her than anybody else.
So would you say in a way that she was kind of just folks? It sounds like, you know, a lot of times celebrities, it's hard to develop a relationship with them.
Oh, she was just folks, absolutely. And her mother and father were elderly when I was first getting to know her. And over the years, they got older and older and infirm and everything. And she would always ask me to look out for her parents. And she's written me notes thanking me for helping her mother and her father and that kind of thing. And her mother ended up with Alzheimer's, and she lived with her for a number of years at the end of her life. And my mother was having similar problems at the same time, and we commiserated about that, you know, and about, you know, what life does and that kind of thing. But we just were very close. And I remember one time Leon and I bought a house for investment purposes, and we were not good at anything like that. We did it at the very time when, just like what's happening now, was happening, and we just almost lost our asses on it. And I remember I was so scared we were going to lose our house. We almost did. And she was great about it. I mean, she let me talk to her and tell her about all my fears and everything. And it felt so good to be able to, because I couldn't even talk to my parents, you know, about stuff like that. I didn't want them to know I'd made such a huge mistake.
So do you think she was just like very down-to-earth kind of person?
Absolutely. And I would hear people make comments. You know, anyone who becomes really famous like she did, or like Oprah, you hear people say, oh, I hear she's a real bitch and stuff like that. And I would always correct them and say, you know, I know her really well, and I know she's not. You know, she expects things to be done right and that kind of thing, but she's not a bitch by any means. I've known her in too many situations. And I heard the same thing about Oprah, and I only met Oprah one time. It was in 1988, and she was delayed for 7 hours here in Atlanta because of weather in Chicago. And she couldn't have been nicer. But for some reason, people have a tendency to think that if someone is celebrated and well-known, that they become nasty. And I can tell you that Oprah was not that way, and I doubt whether she's that way now. And Mrs. King was never that. She was never a bitch. She was always nice to people, unless they were ugly to her. But even then, she never sunk to name calling, and that never, no matter what anybody said. She would tell me like her grand vision, of things, and
What was her grand vision?
well, that more and more people would embrace nonviolent social change, because that was the crux of everything that her husband believed in, and she did too. And in fact, I know that not from her so much, but from other sources, that she went to a real left-wing liberal college, Antioch, and I think really that she hasn't received as much credit as she should for pushing him towards the activism that he did, because she really was, I believe, a bigger activist than he was when they first met. She was at the Boston Conservatory of Music, and he was going to school up there too, and that's where they met. And I think at that point, she was more of a social change activist than he was. And I believe that, she would never have told you that because she was modest, but she really had learned about nonviolence in her education, and felt that was the only way to achieve the goals in the long run. And her idea with the King Center was that it would always be a resource for people who saw the need for social change, and to try to steer them away from violence, and to come there and study King's way, Gandhi's way of doing things to affect change without violence. And I hope that the King Center will go on, now that she's gone and now that her daughter Yolanda's gone. I don't know what the future is for the center, but it's had problems over the years, especially after she was not running it day to day. But I do believe that her vision for it being there in perpetuity will happen. I think it'll always be there in some way.
Did she see the holiday as being like a key to sustaining the vision? Or
there would be no holiday without her. There would, I believe, had he been married to anyone else, that holiday probably wouldn't have happened. But she felt that that was extremely important, and she worked and lobbied and fought for that holiday for years. And to me, that is her single greatest accomplishment. I think she gets all the credit for the holiday. Ronald Reagan signed it, I'm sure because he was backed into the corner and had to sign it, but she always knew that there should be a holiday, and it's a holiday for everybody. I think it's a holiday especially for LGBT people. But she never thought of it as a holiday for people of color. It was always a holiday for everybody to hopefully use the day to do something positive for other people, to give to other people. But that was, I think, the whole idea behind the center, which was to go on and on. But I think from the beginning, she felt like there should be a holiday. Because if you think about where we were as a nation before Dr. King and the civil rights laws that were passed in response to his activism, I just can't imagine America in the 21st century without what happened in the 60s.
When you look at the, I've been to the Park Center a lot of times and the King Center, and it's really extraordinary when you look look at the 50s and the 60s, and you realize that at least in the South, a lot of it was like South Africa used to be.
It was apartheid. I mean, I was very much aware of it, and I was always proud of my parents because I remember when the 1954 Brown versus Board decision came down, a lot of people in my community, in the school, you know, they were saying, the kids that I went to school with, well, my parents aren't going to let me go to school next year. Of course, it didn't happen that fast, but because they weren't going to go to school with black children and all that. And my parents were, they didn't buy into that. They said, well, you know, this is the way it should have been, and it was wrong for it to be the way it was. And I was really proud of them for saying that, you know, and not being like all the other, you know, the typical Southern way of approaching it. I never heard my parents be afraid, talk, you know, in a fearful way about integrating schools. And that was a huge deal when that came down. Everybody just went crazy. As you know, they changed the flag in Georgia, and that was the beginning of all the private Christian schools, you know. They started opening schools everywhere so that children wouldn't have to go to school with black kids. And my parents thought all that was ridiculous. Mrs. King was a real believer in her Christian religion, and I think that she really believed that Martin was in heaven and that they would be reunited someday. I mean, she certainly grieved, but she knew that she had a lot more to do with her life than to grieve. And I think she took her grief and she made that holiday happen because of her grief. You know, she really worked. I mean, she traveled, and she would be, you know, coming in the middle of the night and going out 2 days later, early in the morning. And I mean, I saw how hard she worked for all those years. And I think that she used her grief in a real positive way to help create change. And that holiday creates change. Every year, more and more places celebrate that holiday. Places that you never thought would, that the holiday's now, you know, celebrated. And as it goes on into, you know, the future, the sacrifices that he made and that she made will never be forgotten because of the holiday.
So you think her sense of mission really sustained her?
Oh yeah, absolutely. She didn't let getting tired, and you know, I wish I could have been more like her, really, because I sometimes get really down and just don't do anything. And I don't ever remember seeing her in that mode. She always knew. She had a sense of duty and of mission. And she never did any of it for money. Whatever money she made went to the center and went to her mission. She continued to live in that house on Sunset, which became a worse and worse neighborhood over the years. But none of that meant anything to her. She was absolutely not into material things.
Although she enjoyed first class.
Well, of course, but that's not material, that's comfort. And when you're traveling, you know, 300 days a year, a little bit of comfort there is a good thing, but it wasn't for, she didn't drink, it wasn't for the free booze or anything like that. But to me, just continuing to live in that house, when she could have made a lot of money for herself, because she was a famous person who could get paid lots of money, you know, people, you know, George Bush even says in the new book, he's going to go make a lot of money making speeches. But she was never into it for personal gain, ever. She wasn't interested in jewelry, clothes, any of that. I mean, she was absolutely committed to the cause of social change. She went to Africa numerous times. That is hard to do. I've never been once because I don't want to be on an airplane that long. She went over and over and over again to different places to try to affect positive change in Africa. She adored her children, I know that. And she had a housekeeper for years and years and years, the same lady. And she had a personal assistant that stayed at the house, Patricia Lattimore. And they were family, they were part of the family. They helped raise the children and take care of things that had to be done. But she could not have become a stay-at-home mom because she had a purpose in life, and she knew that. And I think her children knew that, especially as they got older. I'm sure there were times when they were young that maybe they missed their mother because she traveled so much. But I know that all of them learned, as they grew older, they knew that she had a destiny far beyond just being their mother. And had she not upheld that destiny, she would have given up. Well, we would have not had the holiday primarily, or the center. And she did so much good in her lifetime that it went far beyond her family. And it would have been a great loss to humanity, I think, had she just become a stay-at-home mom. So, some people have to do what they're sort of put here to do. And I'm not even a believer, but, destiny just grabs some people, and she was one of those people, and she was a person who knew how to take advantage of it. She was the most loving person in the world. You couldn't ask for a more loving person. Anyone who knew her would just tell you what a caring person she was. I always received birthday card every year, and Leon and I would receive Christmas cards with always handwritten note, and I know I'm just one of hundreds that she did that for, but it's because she cared, and she could have easily gotten by with having an assistant do that kind of thing for her, but she wanted to do it. If I'd ever been in that position, I would have gotten somebody to do it for me. Now, Leon would not have. He was very, very caring, and he would have done that type of thing. He would bend over backwards to do something sweet for somebody, and I would just think, oh, God, that's more trouble than I can deal with. But Miss King was never one to take the easy route. 1986, the Supreme Court, in the Bowers versus Hardwick decision, they upheld the Georgia sodomy law, which meant that all the states that had anti-sodomy laws could continue to keep them. And to Leon and me, that meant that we were still considered to be felons in the privacy of our own homes. And that was a big, big turning point, not only for us, but for the gay community at large. To me, that was the next big thing after Stonewall in '69, Bowers versus Hardwick in '86, because we were sort of coasting along, like I said, on the coattails of the civil rights movement up until then. And then all at once, all progressives thought that Georgia would lose that case in the Supreme Court and sodomy laws would be struck down nationwide. And when they were not, it was like getting hit in the face with a 2x4. We were suddenly reminded that we were third-class citizens, and it made real gay activists out of Leon and me and thousands of other people. In fact, the next year, I attended a conference outside Washington in Virginia called the War Conference, and it was a lot of gay rights leaders from around the country. And it was my first venture into something like that. And that was we'd had a march on Washington in '87, big march. And the result from Congress and the White House was nil. So, hence the war conference, which brought a couple of hundred gay activists from all over the country, both coasts and the Midwest and the South and everywhere. And there was a lot of arguing and fussing and whatever, but the one thing that came out of the war conference was Coming Out Day, National Coming Out Day, October 11th. That was the one thing that we all agreed upon, the only thing that we all agreed upon. But it was resolved at the end of the war conference that October 11th would be National Coming Out Day. But anyway, I had been friends with Mrs. King all those years and had never actually come out. And
she always saw you with Leon.
Many times.
And you and Leon were...
We were invited to her house for Christmas parties and things like that. And he was often at the King Center. And after the center was built, we were there every year during King Week, and we were involved in all the activities. We went to the annual fundraiser, the big fundraiser, the Salute to Greatness dinner. And yet, I never could bring myself to just tell her the whole truth. And so after Bowers Hardwick was when I finally decided it's time. And I did. I called her secretary and said, I really need to talk to Ms. King, and could you ever call me? And I said, it's personal, it doesn't have anything to do with the airline. And she called me that night, late at night, about midnight, and we had about a 2-hour confab on the telephone. And she was so sweet. She said, I told her she knew about Brown versus Hardwick, and she thought it was awful. But we hadn't talked about it until then, and that night on the phone. And in the meantime, I had met Vic Basel, who was executive director. Leon, I'd met him at a little thing. They were trying to introduce the Human Rights Campaign Fund, as it was known then. It was just getting started. And we'd met him here. And I told Vic that I had a real high-profile friend, I didn't tell him who it was, in the civil rights movement. And I wanted this friend to get involved in our movement if possible. And so I told her that it was really important to me for her to do something very visible, that would get national attention. And Leon and I had attended one Human Rights Campaign dinner in New York, and it just blew us away. We didn't know they did things like that. We'd done all these dinners for NAACP and King Center that involved celebrities and all that kind of stuff, but we didn't know gay people did that kind of stuff, and they had just started doing it in New York. And the one we went to was probably the third or fourth one, I think, and Phil Donahue was there, and Dear Abby was there, and Marlo Thomas was there, and to see all these mainline celebrities, that were standing up for us, that then convinced me that I should talk to Ms. King about it. And so I asked her, I told her about that event, and I said, we would really love it if you would do the next dinner. And she said, just tell me where and when, I'll be happy to do it.
So when you came out to her, she was totally fine. And she kind of already knew that.
She knew. She said, Winston, I knew that you and Leon loved each other. And she said, I knew that you had to discuss it with me on your own timetable, whenever you were ready to talk about it. And she said, I just feel real happy that you want to include me, in your life in that way. And she was wonderful. I had tears in my eyes when I was talking to her. And we laughed about a lot of things, and I said, I don't know why I couldn't have done this earlier. But I said, because I knew you loved me. And I said, I felt like you loved Leon too. And she said, I love both of you. And she said, I could see that you were a couple. And so anyway, it was it was one of the nicest things I ever did. And after that, I decided that if I could come out with Coretta King, I could certainly come out with all my siblings, and I did. And because up to that point, we were close to family, both families, but we never ever discussed it. And I thought it was really important to let them all know that Leon and I had been together since April 26, 1964. This was, like 87, 88, and 87 actually, when I went to each one of my siblings. I went to their homes and told them the whole story. And helped them become activists on their own level. My sister in Valdosta, for instance, she knew all along too. She was the most clued in, I think, of all my siblings. And she always managed to have some gay friends, although they didn't usually talk about it either, but she knew they were gay. And after that, she told them about her brother, the big gay activist in Atlanta, and, let them know that.
So you got Mrs. King to be the keynote speaker at the New York dinner.
At the Waldorf Astoria.
That was in 87.
87, I think it was.
Yeah.
And that dinner, the honorees were all Broadway gay people. Jerry Herman and Arthur Lawrence and Harvey Firestein, and a couple of others. I can't remember their names right now, but it was just an incredible night. And she got up and said, "I'm here because my dear friend Winston Johnson asked me to be here, and I'm here to express my solidarity with the gay and lesbian community." That's almost a direct quote, but I was mentioned in her first remarks, which just really made me glow. There were 50 of us there from Atlanta, 5 tables, which was just wonderful too, and we just all were aglow after that. And we came back to Atlanta and decided, 14 of us decided we can do this in Atlanta. And so we got a committee together, and in May of 88, we had our first dinner, a fundraiser for HRC. And
Mrs. King was part of that, right?
Absolutely. She bought a table and paid for it. We tried to give it to her. She said, "No, I want to pay for it." And Martin, her son, bought extra tickets. He bought 2 extra tickets. They had a table, but she brought, all of the people she brought were from the King Center. And all except for one, I think, were all straight people, which I thought was very, very nice that she did that, to bring the straight people from the center to see this huge first event in Atlanta like that.
So in 1988, I guess Lynn Cothran wasn't with her yet.
I think he was with her, but not all the time like he was for many years. Because Lynn was not at the dinner, and I don't know why not, but maybe he hadn't advanced to the level at the center where he would have been included. Because most of the people she brought, like Dolores Harmon, who's in that photograph with me and Ms. King, were real senior people, that I guess she felt like they deserved to be taken out for a big deal dinner. And Lynn was probably one of the youngest people there then, and, was probably not there for that reason. But she adored Lynn. I know that. She loved him just like
he became her chief aide, I think.
Right. For about 20,
I think it's about 20 years.
Over 20 years, I believe. And he became just like her son.
Well, one of the things I'm so glad about is talking to you, because people have thought that he was the one who got her involved in our movement, but you're actually the one.
I'm actually the one who got her involved to begin with, but Lynn is to be credited with getting her to a lot of activities. I got her to the first one and the second one, our first dinner in Atlanta. But Lynn deserves a lot of credit because that was sort of the tail end of mine and Leon's involvement in the gay rights movement, because just before our second dinner in '89, Leon was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And we continued to be somewhat involved for another 2 or 3 years, but then Parkinson's started really taking its toll, and we just kind of had to withdraw from everything, both for financial reasons and for health reasons, and So Lynn was responsible for getting Ms. King to do a lot of speeches and appearances on behalf of gays and lesbians and bisexual, transgendered people after our second dinner in '89. I'd say he gets all the credit. I'll take the credit for getting her involved in the very beginning, but she was ready to do it. And she told me at the time, that night when we had that long conversation, she said if Martin were still alive, he would probably have come to this sooner than I have. But she said, I know he would have come to it because we talked about it. And she just never had any inclination to discriminate against anybody. I mean, she just loved everybody for who they were. It didn't matter. She had a man who was a church pianist, and he was a very sort of flamboyant homosexual. And he was one of her dearest friends. I mean, she made sure he was here for any of the big deal functions that were going on. And I mean, she took care of him, made sure he didn't have to pay for going to the Salute to Greatness dinner and things like that. And she considered him one of her closest friends.
Although you had to really concentrate on Leon and care for him, you still stayed in touch with Mrs. King, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you still maintained your personal
We talked
relationship.
Probably 2 or 3 times a year up until the last couple of years. I didn't realize how sick she was, but I did receive a card that my last birthday card was about 6 months before she died. And when I go back and read it now, it's very clear to me in the card. Anyone that reads it can tell she was saying goodbye to me. I didn't realize it at the time because Leon was really, really sick by then, and I was just the last 6 years of Leon's life, which were the last 6 years of Coretta's life. I was a full-time caregiver, and I was so bogged down in that I couldn't see anything, basically, except my sorrow for seeing that he was leaving me, in every way conceivable. And, but anyway, that last card, Lynn had told me she was having some health problems, but he didn't go into detail, and I'm sure because she didn't want everybody to know how sick she was. But anyway, the last card, she was telling me goodbye. And when I read it now, it's very dear to me because it made it clear to me how much she loved me and Leon. And she wanted to say goodbye even though I didn't know she was dying. She knew Leon was in really bad shape, and she would mention that in her notes the last few years.
So she just was a really good friend to both you and to Leon.
And Oprah bought that wonderful condo in Buckhead for her, and I was so sorry that she only got to enjoy it for about a year or maybe less. And she was so sick by that time. When I heard she was doing that, I was so thrilled because I thought, well, finally she's going to get a really Oprah-style place to live in. And it was sad to me that her life was so short that she didn't get to.
But you said those things really didn't mean that much.
Really didn't. because I'm sure she could have had something like that. She could have had something like that sooner, because she had the ability to make a lot of money, but she never used the money that she made for anything for herself. Which is one reason I'm sure that Oprah wanted to do something really nice for her, because she could do it so easily, you know. But
So you and Lynn, were you pretty good friends?
we were good friends. I met him shortly after he started working there, and then for years, while Eastern was still in business, I would see him.
Did you upgrade her?
Oh, of course, of course. But then Eastern went under in 1991. So, and of course, he and Mrs. King were traveling up until like 98 or 99 constantly. So they became very, very close in those years. And I was sort of out of the picture because there was no more Eastern Airlines, and I had to get another job. And then
And you worked for a limousine company?
for 9 years. And then I quit working in May of 2000 because Leon's health got so bad that he needed me with him all the time. And I guess it was really good that I did that 6-month military duty after all, 6 months and 6 years, because I was able to go to the VA for my health care. And had I not had that, I wouldn't have been able to quit working, because I'd already had prostate cancer and I knew I couldn't afford insurance. So I started going to the VA and I quit my job, and I took care of Leon those last 6 years of his life. And they were 6 of the best years of our lives, really, because all of the things that you have conflicts about, and, you know, sexuality, because of my illness and his, was a thing of the past. And so it was just refined right down to the basics of just love and affection. And we were so affectionate those last 6 years. It was just nothing more wonderful than to hold him in my arms and tell him I love you. And so I was very lucky that I was able to quit work in 2000. And then he died in February 16th of 2006 in my arms. The last 2 days he was alive. I just held him. And I can't think of a better way to have lost him. I'm so glad he didn't have to go to a nursing home, and he was able to be with me at home to the very last. So, at our first table captain dinner for our table captain party for the HRCF dinner in 1988, the first thing was in the fall of '87, and he said, "I just want to make it perfectly clear that I am now a full-time gay activist, which means that I'm going to have to give up my career as a male model," which made everyone crack up because Leon was definitely not a male model. But anyway, he had a great sense of humor and was a great activist.
Well, I just think it just sounds like you like the dynamic duo, you and he.
I guess we were. Our lives certainly wound down those last few years, but.
Well, you were able to. The one that I want to close on, I want you to tell the dildo story.
Oh. Well, at our first dinner, Kate Clinton, the lesbian comic, who is just wonderful, we had never met her before. We met her then, and she was part of our program. And Mrs. King and her table were right next to our table. And so Kate is doing her comedy routine, and she tells a couple of sort of off-color things, and then the one that just really embarrassed Leon, well, me too, but especially him, was she made some kind of comment about the dildo races, whatever that was. But anyway, it got a big laugh. But Leon and I just almost shrunk under the table. We were so embarrassed. Leon said, "Oh my God, I can't believe she said that with Coretta King in the audience." And so dinner broke up not long after that. And as we were speaking to everybody, she was right there behind us. And he turned around and he said, "Ms. King, I am so sorry about those off-color remarks that Kate Clinton made." And she just put her arms around him and hugged him, and she said, "Honey, I'm a big girl, it's okay." And this very year, 2007, Kate Clinton was here for the first time since then, our 20th anniversary dinner. And I told Kate that before dinner. And so she told that story to the whole dinner this year. So.
Oh, the last thing is that the award is in your and Leon's names, right? Tell us about that.
Well, right after Leon died, Edie Coffrin called and asked if it would be okay if they honored us at the dinner in '06. And I said, "Of course, I'm flattered." And so they presented an award to me and posthumously to Leon to recognize our contribution, in the early days, and they announced that night that from then on the Community Service Award would be called the Leon Allen and Winston Johnson Community Service Award, which was just an incredible honor. And so this year was the first time that it was presented that way.
So I guess that we're never going to forget you guys.
Well, I hope not. I hope not. It'd be nice to know that somebody
You're my
remembers us.
hero. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. God, I just loved her so much, and so did Leon. And he died.
She sounds like an amazing friend.
He died almost exactly 2 weeks after she did. He was on his deathbed when she died, and he was not even aware.
He wasn't aware.
I had the TV going, and they were singing, and I went in, and he was in bed in there, and I crawled in with him. I was crying, and I said, "Do you know what that is?" And he didn't know. And I said, "That's Coretta's funeral." And he didn't respond at all. I knew if he understood what I said, he would have cried, because he cried so easily, especially those last few years. So he didn't know. But anyway, she died, I think, on the 30th. Yeah. And he died on the 30th of January. He died on the February the 16th.